The last thing I heard as the heavy oak door closed behind me was my father's cold voice cutting through the air. If you want to be a nobody, Zora, go be one somewhere else. Go live in the streets. He said it during Thanksgiving dinner, right in front of everyone. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the nobody he threw out had a net worth of over $25 million. My name is Zora Bellamy, and that night was supposed to be peaceful. I had done everything my mother asked, including parking my plane rental car 3 blocks away so it wouldn't clutter the driveway. I stepped into the house knowing exactly how the night would go. It was always the same. My father, Clayton, praised my sister Kendra's fiancé, Thayer, for having a real job, even though Thayer barely held on to his junior executive position. My mother, Elise, couldn't stop talking about Kendra's wedding plans, showing off dress photos as if she were the one getting married. And every now and then, someone would look at me and ask about my little computer hobby, like I was a child playing with toys instead of the founder of a growing tech company. I stayed quiet, patient, pretending their words didn't stab the same old wounds. I wore my thrift store sweater, kept my hair simple, and smiled when they laughed at my struggling life. It was easier to let them believe the lie. But then something changed. Maybe it was years of being treated like I didn't matter. Maybe it was the way my father rolled his eyes when I said I was doing fine. Or maybe it was just the final drop in a cup that had been overflowing for years. Clayton slammed his hand on the table. You sit there and eat our food while doing nothing with your life. We're tired of carrying you, he shouted. Get out. If you want to be a nobody, go be one somewhere else. Everyone went silent. No one defended me. Not even Kendra. So I stood up, pushed in my chair, and walked out without a single tear. For the first time in my life, I felt strangely free. I sat in my rental car, breathing slowly, letting the quiet wrap around me. I thought maybe someone would call. Maybe someone would check on me. But when my phone buzzed, it wasn't an apology. It was a bank alert. A $250,000 loan had just been taken out in my name. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I opened the details and saw the forged documents. My name, my information, my signature that wasn't mine. In that moment, the truth hit me harder than my father's words ever could. They hadn't just kicked me out. They had tried to trap me in debt on my way out the door. That was the night I stopped being their quiet, ignored daughter and became the woman who would change everything. I grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in a house that always felt warm on the outside, but cold whenever it came to me. From a young age, I loved coding and building systems. It made me happy, and it was the one place where everything made sense. But whenever I tried to show my parents what I was working on, they looked at me like I was speaking another language. My father, a real estate developer, thought anything outside his world was useless. My mother, who cared more about parties and appearances, simply brushed me off. They didn't understand me, and after a while, they stopped trying. At the same time, my sister Kendra fit perfectly into the image they wanted. She danced, she smiled. She was the kind of daughter they could show off at gatherings. Even when she did something small, like getting a part in a school play, the whole house filled with excitement. My parents opened a bottle of champagne and called relatives to share the great news. Everyone acted like she had won an award of national importance. Meanwhile, when I brought home real achievements, high grades, academic awards, even the full-ride scholarship I worked so hard for, they barely reacted. My father would nod without looking up from his phone. My mother would say, "That's nice, dear," and then return to talking about Kendra's next recital. Slowly, I learned that nothing I did would ever shine as brightly in their eyes. I wasn't a troublemaker. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. I simply faded into the background. It was easier to be quiet than to keep hurting myself by hoping for attention that never came. I became the child who sat in her room with her laptop, while downstairs they clapped for Kendra. They didn't mean to push me into the shadows, but they did it every single day. Over time, I noticed a pattern. If Kendra sneezed, they gave her sympathy and blankets. If I was sick, they told me not to make a big deal out of it. If Kendra wanted something, they made it happen. If I needed anything, they asked if I could figure it out on my own. It was clear who mattered more, and it wasn't me. Even as a child, it hurt in a way I couldn't explain. I kept thinking that if I worked harder or acted more like Kendra, maybe they would finally see me. But no matter how much I achieved, I stayed invisible. Being ignored became a normal part of my life. Looking back now, I understand the truth. I wasn't the child they wanted. I was the child they tolerated. Kendra was the star, and I was the quiet problem they didn't know how to handle. Growing up like that doesn't just make you strong. It makes you learn how to survive in silence. I carried that silence for years, until the day everything finally broke. When I left for college, it felt like the first real breath I had ever taken. For once, no one was comparing me to Kendra or telling me what I should be. I finally had space to think, to create, and to imagine a future that belonged to me alone. I spent most of my time in the computer labs, staying up late to work on projects that excited me more than any class ever could. After 2 years, I realized that what I wanted couldn't be learned from lectures or textbooks. I wanted to build something real. So I made a decision that shocked everyone except me. I dropped out. I rented a tiny room, bought the cheapest desk I could find, and started building what would become my fraud detection software, Bellamy Systems. Those early days were difficult. I lived on noodles, worked until my eyes burned, and barely slept. There were moments when I doubted myself, when nothing seemed to work and the screen stayed blank no matter how many times I tried. But even in those moments, I felt more alive than I ever had growing up at home. The first time a company took interest in my work, I almost cried. It wasn't a big contract, but it was enough to help me buy better equipment and keep going. Slowly, more clients came. My software improved. My name started spreading quietly through the tech world, not because of my background, but because my product actually worked. When I signed my first major deal, a contract big enough to change my life, I sat on the floor of my tiny room and laughed like a child. For the first time, I felt like someone who mattered. But even as my success grew, I knew one thing for sure. My family could never know. If they found out, they would twist it into their own story. My mother would claim she always believed in me. My father would insist his discipline shaped me. And worst of all, they would use my money to fuel Kendra's perfect little life. Her wedding, her house, her lifestyle, all of it would suddenly become my responsibility. I couldn't let that happen. So I built a wall of silence around my achievements. I showed up to family gatherings in old sweaters from thrift stores. I drove basic rental cars instead of the luxury models I could easily afford. When Uncle Ross pulled me aside to give me advice on how to write a simple resume, I smiled and nodded like I was grateful. I let them believe I was barely getting by, a girl who needed their guidance. The truth was very different. Behind that simple image, I was building an empire, quietly, steadily, and with no one to steal the credit. Bellamy Systems became my world, and every success was mine alone. I protected it with everything I had, even if it meant pretending to be someone smaller. In a strange way, hiding made me stronger. I learned to move silently, to succeed without applause, and to keep my power where no one could reach it. And I had no idea then just how important that silence would become. Kendra had always been the center of everything in our family, and I saw it more clearly as we grew older. By the time she got engaged to Thayer, my parents treated her life like it was the biggest project they had ever worked on. They talked about her wedding plans at every family dinner, and any small update about her was treated like breaking news. Meanwhile, I sat quietly, listening from the corner like I usually did. Thayer tried to present himself as a successful man, but I could see through him right away. He was polite, well-dressed, and good at pretending he had everything under control. But behind that smooth smile, his job wasn't secure. He acted more important than he really was, and my parents loved him for it. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about how good he looked standing next to Kendra. Whenever I visited, I watched Kendra carefully. She always looked perfect. Her makeup was flawless, her clothes were expensive, and she never let a single hair fall out of place. She carried herself like someone who knew she was the favorite, but I also saw the pressure sitting on her shoulders. She couldn't relax. She couldn't mess up. She had to be the version of herself my parents showed off to the world. But that perfect life wasn't real. My parents spent money they didn't have to maintain Kendra's image. They paid for everything: dress fittings, beauty treatments, wedding deposits, expensive dinners, and endless parties. Every time I visited, there was a new bill lying on the kitchen counter, a new financial promise they shouldn't have made. They kept pretending they were fine, but I knew they were running on credit and hope. As I watched all of this, I realized something. Kendra wasn't as free as she looked. She was trapped in a life built on expectations and fear of disappointing everyone. She smiled, but her eyes always seemed tired. She enjoyed being admired, but she could never breathe without worrying what people would think. Her whole world depended on looking perfect, even if it meant falling apart on the inside. My world was nothing like hers. I didn't have to pretend. I didn't have to perform. My money was real, earned from years of hard work, and I didn't owe anyone an explanation. I wore simple clothes because I liked them. I didn't need attention or approval. I lived quietly and peacefully, without the weight of someone else's dream on my back. Sometimes when I looked at Kendra, I felt a mix of confusion and sadness. She had everything I thought I wanted growing up: love, attention, praise. But now I saw that she was stuck in a shiny cage. My parents had given her the spotlight, but they also chained her to it. She was their golden child. I was the forgotten one. But I was the only one who was truly free. When I sat in my rental car after leaving the house that Thanksgiving night, I stared at the bank alert on my phone for a long moment. A $250,000 loan in my name. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe the bank mixed up accounts. Maybe it was a glitch. But deep down, something cold and heavy settled in my chest. I knew exactly who would dare to use my name without asking. I started making calls. In my field, people knew me, even if my family didn't know the real me. When I asked for information, I didn't get pushed around or ignored. Within minutes, I had the documents pulled up. And there it was, my name, my information, my signature. Only it wasn't my signature. It was a shaky copy of it, written by someone who didn't even take the time to practice. My father had signed it. Seeing his name in the lender's notes felt like a punch. He had used my identity to secure a huge loan, and he hadn't even hesitated. The money had been sent straight to an account linked to him. I dug deeper, and the truth unfolded piece by piece, like a cruel joke that only I wasn't laughing at. The loan was for Kendra's wedding. Not for an emergency. Not for something life or death. For a party. And not just that. Part of the money was set aside as a down payment on a house for Kendra and They. My father had used my name to pay for a future that wasn't mine. A future for the daughter they loved more. The daughter they always picked. The daughter who never had to worry about anything. The reality settled over me slowly, like icy water running down my back. My family hadn't just kicked me out that night. They had tried to destroy my financial life on the way out. They didn't care what consequences I might face. They didn't stop to think how a loan like that could affect my credit, my business, my safety. I was simply an easy tool, a name they could use and toss aside. And the worst part? They expected me to never find out. They thought I was too small, too quiet, too unimportant to ever look into it. As I held my phone, I felt something change inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was a steady, sharp kind of clarity. For the first time, I saw exactly how far they were willing to go. This wasn't just neglect anymore. It wasn't just favoritism. It was betrayal on a level I never imagined my own family capable of. Using my identity for debt was a crime. Forging my signature was a crime. And they had done it so easily, for a wedding and a house they couldn't afford. That night, sitting alone in my car, I realized something important. My silence had protected them for years. My quiet life, my hidden success, my distance, it all made it easy for them to take advantage without fear. But they had crossed the line. And for the first time, I wasn't going to let it go. After discovering what my father had done, I didn't rush into confrontation. I knew that shouting or showing anger wouldn't fix anything. I needed a plan, and it had to be quiet and smart. I had resources they didn't know about, and I decided to use them. I contacted a trusted lawyer I had worked with before and explained everything. Together, we set up a shell company, a way to make moves without my family ever realizing who was behind them. The first target was my father's real estate business. It had been struggling for a while, and I knew the debts it owed. Slowly, quietly, my team started buying up the commercial debt tied to his firm. No one called to ask permission, no one knew what was happening, and I watched from a distance as the pieces began to shift. Next, I turned my attention to my parents' social life. The country club they were so proud of, the place where they showed off connections, hosted parties, and built their image, was heavily in debt. It was the center of their social power, but it was fragile. I used the same method to acquire it quietly. By the time any of them noticed, I was already the silent owner of the very place they thought proved their status. The most satisfying part was how invisible I was. I didn't need recognition, and I didn't want it. My parents had spent years ignoring me, treating me like I didn't exist. Now, the power that controlled their business and social life rested in my hands, and they had no idea. I didn't make threats. I didn't send messages. I didn't confront them with accusations. Everything happened quietly, methodically, with the precision I had used to build my company from the ground up. Watching it all from the background, I felt a strange calm. While they continued to live their lives as if nothing had changed, the foundation beneath them was already shifting. I controlled the debts that could topple their business and the club that gave them their social standing. They were still living in the illusion of power, but I held the real control. It was silent. It was invisible. And it was perfect. For once, the family that had tried to use me, ignore me, and betray me had no idea that the person they thought was powerless was actually the one holding all the cards. This quiet acquisition wasn't about showing off or revenge in the traditional sense. It was about establishing control, creating leverage, and making sure that the people who had hurt me could never touch me again. It was the beginning of the next chapter, and I was ready to write it my way. I didn't rush or act impulsively. I waited until everything was in place, then I started pulling the threads. The first sign came to my father's real estate firm. They received a notice that their line of credit was being called in. The new debt holder was listed, but there was no name he recognized. He didn't know that I was behind it. Panic started to seep into the office. His confident front faltered, and he tried to tell himself it was the economy or some unlucky timing. He didn't suspect me. At the same time, my mother's carefully curated world began to wobble. The country club, the centerpiece of her social life, sent a letter saying that the family's membership was under review. There were mentions of financial irregularities and pending obligations that had to be resolved. Elise, who always acted so sure of herself, suddenly looked uneasy. She called friends, whispered questions, and tried to figure out what could have gone wrong. But she didn't have a clue that the person who had been ignored and pushed away was the one controlling everything. I watched all of it quietly. From the outside, nothing seemed different. My parents continued their daily routines, acting like their world was perfect and intact. But I knew how fragile it had become. Every call they made, every frantic meeting, every whispered conversation was a thread I had already started pulling. Their perfect image of control and success was unraveling without them understanding why. The funny part was that they blamed everything else but me. The market, the vendors, the economy. Anyone and anything except the daughter they had sent away. They couldn't imagine that I, the quiet, overlooked child, could be the one holding all the cards. That gave me even more satisfaction. As the days went by, the tension in the house and the office grew. I stayed in the shadows, letting them wrestle with problems they didn't see coming. The firm's financial strain started to show in meetings. My father grew tense, more irritable. My mother's conversations became shorter, more worried. And still, no one thought of me. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to confront them. I just needed to pull the threads carefully, let their own choices and past actions bring the panic. They had built their world on appearances, on illusions, and now the illusion was cracking. And I was the quiet hand pulling it apart, one invisible thread at a time. Kendra's perfect life began to show cracks, and it was both painful and fascinating to watch. The pressure she had always hidden behind her smiles and polished appearances started to catch up with her. Thayer, the man she had been counting on, lost his job. It wasn't a shock to me. His position had never been secure. But for Kendra, it was devastating. The stability she relied on vanished overnight, leaving her anxious and unsure. Then the wedding plans began to fall apart. Vendors who had been booked months in advance started calling, canceling their services. Some cited scheduling conflicts, others claimed payment issues. The truth was simple. My father had stopped covering the bills. The money he had promised for Kendra's extravagant wedding wasn't there anymore, and the house of cards began to collapse. Each cancellation, each unanswered request, added to the tension in the family. I watched quietly from the sidelines, careful not to reveal myself. I didn't need anyone to know that I was behind what was happening. It wasn't about humiliation for its own sake. It was about showing them the consequences of their choices. The favoring of Kendra at my expense, the ignoring of me, the thoughtless betrayal. The tension between Kendra and our parents grew. Fights became louder, more public, and more vicious. They shouted in the driveway, in restaurants, and even during family gatherings. My mother tried to maintain a calm, superior tone, but it couldn't hide the fear and frustration. My father barked orders and blamed everyone but himself. Their golden child, the one they had lavished attention on, was crumbling under the pressure they had helped create. I even intervened in small, subtle ways, without anyone realizing it. Kendra had a favorite designer she loved for her wedding dresses and party outfits. One day, I made a simple anonymous call, and the designer suddenly could not extend credit. Kendra panicked, of course, but she didn't know why. Every tiny setback added to the stress, pushing the illusion of her perfect life further toward collapse. It was strange to feel both pity and satisfaction at the same time. Kendra was overwhelmed because of decisions she didn't even make, yet the pattern was clear. My parents had built her life like a showpiece, fragile and dependent on their money and control. She had been forced to appear perfect, to smile and charm, to rely on their endless support, and now the support was gone. From my quiet distance, I could see the truth of it all. The house of cards was finally tumbling. The golden child, so carefully crafted and adored, could no longer hold the facade. And I, the overlooked, the ignored, the nobody, was the only one watching clearly, understanding the fragility of everything they had tried to build on someone else's back. After weeks of chaos, my parents finally reached out. Not with apologies, not with regret, but with desperation. They wanted help. They believed my tech job, the one they had always ignored, might be enough to save them. They asked for a meeting, trying to sound casual, like nothing serious had happened, but I could hear the panic under their practiced voices. They suggested a neutral corporate office, a place they assumed I had no connection to. I let them think it was just some building I rented for convenience. They didn't know I actually owned it through my holding company. Every detail of the meeting was under my control, and I made sure it would feel like a trap without them realizing it. The day arrived. They walked in, looking uneasy but trying to maintain composure. My father tried to straighten his tie and act confident, while my mother kept glancing at the doors, probably hoping someone else might save them. Kendra was with them, silent and tense, like she finally sensed the cracks in the world she had always relied on. I let them wait in a stark meeting room. No pictures, no decorations, nothing familiar. The room itself was intimidating in its emptiness. Their discomfort grew as my lawyer, stoic and unflinching, listened to them explain their problems. They begged, they flustered, and they offered excuses. Every word they spoke revealed their helplessness, and they didn't realize who was really in control. Finally, I entered. I didn't rush. I didn't yell. I didn't show emotion. I walked in with calm, deliberate steps. They looked at me and expected the daughter they had always dismissed, the quiet one who had left without a fight. They were wrong. I introduced myself, not as Zora, their daughter, but as the principal of the holding company that now controlled every debt and obligation they had. The air in the room shifted instantly. My father's jaw tightened. My mother's eyes widened. Kendra's face paled. They didn't understand at first. They couldn't. The nobody they had cast out, the child they ignored and belittled, was the one who had orchestrated the unraveling of everything they had built. Their pleading grew louder, more desperate. Every plan, every excuse, every demand they made was irrelevant to me. I had no intention of giving them back control. I simply listened, letting them feel the weight of their actions. In that moment, I realized the power of silence and patience. I didn't need to yell or fight. I didn't need to gloat or argue. The truth, my control, my planning, my success, spoke louder than any words could. The family that had tried to crush me was finally seeing me as I truly was. Unstoppable, untouchable, and entirely in charge. It was my silent, perfect victory. After the confrontation, I set the terms clearly and calmly. I wouldn't press criminal charges for the forgery my father committed, but only if they agreed to a legally binding, no-contact arrangement. No more calls, no more visits, no more attempts to involve me in their lives. They signed without hesitation, desperate to regain any sense of stability. Next, I took control of my father's flagship project. Instead of letting it crumble or using it to harm anyone, I converted it into affordable housing. It became a permanent, public reminder of the choices he had made and the failures that came from greed and neglect. Every unit told the story of a family that had built illusions instead of solid foundations. The country club, once the symbol of my mother's social pride, was quietly sold to a hotel chain. It no longer served as a stage for her status or a playground for their image-driven lives. Kendra and Thayer's wedding, long planned and anticipated, was indefinitely postponed. The lavish celebrations they had imagined could no longer take place under the weight of reality. I didn't feel the need to gloat. I didn't post updates or make announcements. My satisfaction came from the quiet knowledge that everything they relied on was now under my influence. But I moved on with my life without fanfare. My revenge wasn't about yelling, exposing, or shaming. It was about creating consequences that reflected the truth. Finally, I returned to my own life, the one I had built quietly and carefully over the years. Sitting in my true home, looking out over the city lights, I felt a sense of peace I had never known in my childhood home. The stress, the favoritism, the betrayals, all of it had been left behind. Meanwhile, the family that had once told me to go live in the streets struggled to find financial footing. They scrambled to fix what they had broken, to manage obligations they had ignored for so long. And yet, they didn't reach out to me. They had no idea that the person they had discarded owned the very ground beneath them. The story wasn't about revenge in the way most people think. It wasn't about anger or punishment. It was about control, independence, and justice delivered without a word raised, without violence, without spectacle. I had built a life they couldn't touch, a foundation stronger than their illusions. As I looked at the city stretching out below me, I realized that the quiet choices I had made, the patience, the planning, the silence, were far more powerful than any confrontation could ever have been. I was free, at last, and the world I had created reflected everything I had worked for. Do you think Zora was right to let her family face the consequences? Or should she have forgiven them and helped? Share your thoughts in the comments. For more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications.